Nashville in the early 2000s wasn't quite the glittering country music capital it would later become. Sure, there were neon signs and cowboy boots and the constant hum of guitars drifting from open doorways on Broadway. But just a few blocks off the main drag, things moved slower. The air smelled like rain-washed pavement and old brick, and most folks kept to themselves. That's where you'd find the Velvet Note, a narrow, dimly lit jazz lounge tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered bookstore. It wasn't fancy. The carpet had seen better decades, the bar stools squeaked when you sat down, and the whiskey selection leaned heavily toward cheap but honest. But for a certain kind of person, the kind who liked their music raw and their conversations quiet, it was a refuge. The owner, Rick, had run the place for nearly 15 years. He wasn't a musician himself, but he loved the sound of one. He'd started the club after a failed stint selling used cars, figuring that if he couldn't sell anything with four wheels, maybe he could sell something with soul. He had a loud laugh, a quick temper, and a habit of judging people within 3 seconds of meeting them. Most of the time he was right, but not always. It was a Tuesday in late March when she walked in. Rain had been falling on and off all day, leaving the sidewalk slick and the air thick with damp. The lunch crowd had long since gone, and the evening crowd hadn't shown up yet. Rick was behind the bar, wiping down glasses with a rag that had probably never been clean, when the door creaked open. She stepped inside like she wasn't sure she belonged there. Maybe she didn't. She was older, somewhere in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun and a faded floral dress that looked like it had been washed 100 times too many. She carried a small leather satchel, the kind you might use for sheet music or knitting, and her shoes were sensible, scuffed at the toes. She stood just inside the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the low light, then walked slowly toward the bar. Rick watched her come, already forming an opinion. Tourist, retiree, someone who'd gotten lost on the way to the senior center. He didn't mean to be unkind, he just didn't have time for dreamers. The rent was due, the fridge needed restocking, and his last piano player had quit after one too many complaints about not enough bass. "Afternoon," he said, not unkindly but without much warmth either. "Good afternoon," she replied. Her voice was soft but clear, like water over smooth stones. She smiled, a small polite thing, and set her satchel on the bar. Rick waited. When she didn't say more, he raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you with something?" "I was wondering," she began, glancing toward the upright piano in the corner. It was an old thing, slightly out of tune, with one key that stuck if you pressed it too hard. "Do you happen to need a pianist?" Rick blinked. Then he laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but the kind you give when something catches you off guard, like someone asking if you need a penguin for your backyard. "A pianist?" He shook his head, chuckling. "Lady, this ain't Carnegie Hall. We mostly do blues nights. Open mic on Thursdays and the occasional singer-songwriter who thinks he's the next Dylan." He leaned forward, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. "Between you and me, most of them can barely hold a tune." She didn't flinch, just nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "I understand. But I play, and I'd be happy to fill in, just for a night if you'd like." Rick studied her. She didn't look like a performer. No flashy jewelry, no stage makeup, no nervous energy. She looked like someone who baked pies and watered geraniums. Still, something about her quiet confidence made him pause. "You got experience?" he asked, more out of curiosity than hope. "Oh yes," she said simply. "A lifetime of it," he snorted. "We all got a lifetime of something." Then, turning to the two staff members restocking napkins nearby, he grinned. "Hey, you hear that? She's got a lifetime of piano playing." He laughed again, louder this time. "Tell you what, if you play the piano, I'll leave." The staff chuckled. It was a throwaway line, the kind you say when you're trying to be funny and dismissive at the same time. He didn't mean it. Not really. But the words hung in the air a second too long. She didn't smile. Didn't frown either. She just looked at him, calm as a still pond, and said, "Then I guess you'll be stepping out for a while." Rick froze. There was no anger in her voice, no sarcasm, just a quiet certainty that caught him off guard. For the first time, he really looked at her. Not as a random old lady, but as a person. Her eyes were sharp, deep-set, and full of something he couldn't name. Maybe memory, maybe patience, maybe both. He cleared his throat. "All right," he said, more to himself than to her. Fine, we've got a slow slot next Tuesday. 15 minutes. 8 o'clock. If the crowd likes you, maybe we talk about more. She nodded. Thank you. No promises, he added quickly, suddenly feeling like he'd given away too much. And no fancy classical stuff. People come here to unwind, not take a music history exam. I'll keep that in mind, she said, picking up her satchel. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and don't worry. I won't make you leave. Not really. Rick watched her go, the bell above the door jingling softly as it closed behind her. He stood there for a full minute, staring at the empty doorway. Then he shook his head and muttered, "Crazy old bird." But later that night, as he locked up, he found himself glancing at the piano. He hadn't touched it in years, not since his ex-wife used to play it on slow nights back when they still spoke to each other. He ran a hand over the dusty lid and wondered, just for a second, what kind of music someone like her would make. The week passed like most weeks did, slow, steady, unremarkable. Tuesday arrived with more rain. By 7:30, the lounge was nearly empty. A couple sat in the back booth, sharing a basket of fries and whispering like they were planning a heist. An older man in a trucker hat nursed a beer at the bar, flipping through a newspaper that was 2 days old. Rick stood behind the counter, polishing the same glass for the third time, trying not to look at the clock. At exactly 8, the door opened again. She walked in the same way, quiet, unhurried. This time she wore a simple navy cardigan over her dress, and her hair was neatly pinned. She nodded to Rick, who gave a stiff wave in return, then made her way to the piano. No one paid her much attention. The couple kept talking. The trucker didn't look up. Rick leaned against the bar, arms crossed, half expecting her to fumble with the bench or ask where the sheet music stand was. But she didn't. She sat down, adjusted the bench with a practiced motion, and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, she just sat there, eyes closed, breathing. Then she began to play. It wasn't a song anyone recognized, not at first. It started low and slow, like a memory rising from deep water. The notes were rich and warm, full of spaces between them, as if each one needed room to breathe. The melody twisted through blues and gospel, brushed against something classical, then settled into a rhythm that felt both ancient and brand new. The couple in the back stopped talking. The trucker lowered his paper. Even the ice machine in the corner seemed to hush. Rick stood frozen, glass forgotten in his hand. He'd heard plenty of piano players over the years, some good, some terrible, most forgettable. But this was different. It wasn't just technique. It was feeling. Every note carried weight, like it had lived a whole life before landing on that key. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just listened, and for the first time in a long time he felt something he couldn't name. Something close to awe. When the 15 minutes were up, she stopped as quietly as she'd begun. No flourish, no bow, just lifted her hands, smoothed her dress, and stood. The silence lasted 3 full heartbeats. Then the trucker clapped. Not politely, loudly, genuinely. The couple joined in, then the bartender, then Rick, though he didn't realize he was doing it until his palm stung. She turned, surprised by the applause, and offered a small, shy smile. Rick walked over, his boots thudding on the worn carpet. He stopped a few feet from the piano, suddenly unsure what to say. He searched for the right word. Who taught you to play like that? She looked at him, her eyes kind but distant, like she was seeing something far away. No one taught me, she said softly. I just never stopped. He wanted to ask more. Where she'd learned, why she'd disappeared, why she was here now. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he just nodded. You're playing next week, he said. It wasn't a question, she smiled again. If you'll have me. I'll have you, he said. And for the first time in years, he meant it. As she gathered her things and left, Rick stood by the piano, staring at the keys. The room felt different now, lighter somehow, like the music had swept out the dust of years. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he knew one thing for sure. He hadn't left when she played, and he didn't plan to. The next Tuesday came faster than anyone expected. Word had spread, not through posters or social media, but the old-fashioned way. Hushed conversations at coffee shops, nods between regulars at the hardware store, a mention over the counter at the diner down the street. You hear about the piano lady at the Velvet Note? Someone would say, and the other person would lean in like they were being let in on a secret. By 7:30 that evening, the usual empty chairs were filling up. Not with crowds. This wasn't a concert hall, but with people who knew good music when they heard it. The couple from last week. Kay returned, this time with a friend. The trucker was back, wearing a clean flannel shirt and sitting up straighter. A few college students from the music school nearby wandered in, drawn by rumors of something real. Even the old man who ran the laundromat next door showed up, wiping his hands on a towel like he'd just stepped away from folding someone's socks. Rick stood behind the bar, watching it all unfold with a mix of disbelief and quiet pride. He'd done nothing to promote her. No flyers, no announcements, yet here they were. He'd tuned the piano himself that afternoon, using a wrench and an old tuning fork he'd found in the back storage closet. It still wasn't perfect, but it was better. He'd even wiped down the bench and placed a small glass of water on the piano lid, like he'd seen in movies. At exactly 8, the door opened. She walked in the same way, calm, unhurried, as if she hadn't noticed the extra bodies in the room. She wore a soft gray dress this time with a string of simple pearls at her neck. She nodded to Rick, gave a small wave to the trucker, who tipped his cap, and made her way to the piano without fanfare. No one spoke as she sat down. The air felt thick with anticipation, like before a summer storm. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes for just a second, and began. This time she didn't play something new. She started with a tune everyone sort of knew, the opening chords of Georgia on My Mind. But it wasn't the version made famous by the greats. It was slower, deeper, full of spaces where the silence spoke as loudly as the notes. She added runs that sounded like rain on a tin roof, harmonies that curled like smoke from a chimney. Halfway through, she wove in a melody that no one recognized, a thread of her own making, so seamlessly that it felt like it had always belonged there. A woman near the front dabbed her eyes with a napkin. The college students stopped fidgeting with their phones. The laundromat owner leaned forward, elbows on the table, like he was trying to catch every note in his hands. Rick watched from behind the bar, arms crossed, heart pounding in a way he hadn't felt since he was a kid sneaking into rock shows. He'd heard this song 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with so much life in it. It wasn't just music, it was memory, longing, home. When she finished, the room didn't erupt in cheers. It exhaled. A long collective breath of awe. Then came the applause, slow at first, then building until the whole room was clapping, some people even standing. She turned, surprised again, and gave that same small, humble smile. But this time there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Relief, maybe, or the quiet joy of being truly heard. After her set, people lingered. No one rushed out. The couple bought another round. The students hovered near the piano, too shy to approach but clearly wanting to. The trucker finally walked over. "That last part," he said, voice rough but gentle. "The part you made up. My mama used to hum something like that when I was a boy. Never heard it since she passed." She looked at him, really looked, and nodded. "Some songs live in us longer than we do," she said softly. He didn't say anything else, just patted the piano lid like it was an old friend and walked back to his seat. Rick finally found his voice. He brought her a glass of sweet tea, no charge, and stood beside the piano, unsure how to start. "You've been playing a long time, haven't you?" he asked, keeping his tone light though his chest felt tight. "A very long time," she said, sipping the tea, "since I was 4 years old. My grandmother had an old upright in her parlor. I used to sneak in after bedtime and press the keys with my toes so I wouldn't wake anyone." Rick laughed, surprised. "Your toes?" She smiled. "I was small and determined." He wanted to ask more, where she'd played, who she'd played for, why she'd disappeared, but something held him back. It wasn't just politeness, it was respect. Like asking too soon would be like tearing open a letter that wasn't meant for him yet. Instead, he said, "You're playing every Tuesday now. No more 15 minutes. You take as long as you need." She looked at him, eyes searching his face. "You sure? People might get tired of an old woman at the piano." "People aren't tired," he said, glancing around the room. "They're hungry. For this." He gestured to the piano. For real music, she didn't argue. Just nodded like she'd been waiting for someone to say that for a long time. Over the next few weeks, Tuesdays became an event. Not loud or flashy, just meaningful. People started arriving early to get a good seat. Someone brought a small vase of wildflowers and left it on the piano, A local photographer snapped a few candid shots and hung one behind the bar, her hands on the keys, eyes closed, bathed in the warm glow of a single overhead lamp. Rick began to change too. He stopped rushing through the day like it was a chore. He listened more. He even started humming while he wiped down the bar. One night after closing, he sat at the piano himself just for a minute and pressed a few keys, clumsy and out of tune. He laughed at himself, but it was a good laugh, the kind that comes from trying something new. Then came the night everything shifted. It was a rainy Thursday, open mic night, but no one showed up to sing. Just a handful of regulars nursing drinks. Rick was about to call it early when she walked in, not on a Tuesday, but unexpected. "Mind if I play?" she asked. "Be my guest," he said, surprised but pleased. She sat down and played something different this time, faster, sharper, full of fire. It was a blues number, raw and aching, with a left-hand rhythm that sounded like a train rolling through the dark. Halfway through, she began to sing. Her voice wasn't young. It was weathered, cracked in places, but strong, like an old oak that survived every storm. She sang about lost love, hard roads, and the kind of hope that doesn't shout but endures. When she hit the final note, holding it long and clear, the room fell utterly silent. One of the regulars, a man who rarely spoke, stood up slowly. "Ma'am," he said, voice thick, "you ever record any of that?" She shook her head. "Not in a long time." "You should," he said. "People need to hear this." After that night, things began to move faster. A young woman who worked at a local radio station happened to be in the audience. She recorded a short clip on her phone, not for anything official, just because she couldn't help it. She posted it online with a simple caption, "Found a legend playing piano in a Nashville dive bar. You won't believe your ears." She didn't expect it to go anywhere. But by morning, the clip had been shared hundreds of times. By the end of the week, it had thousands of views. Comments poured in. "Who is this? This sounds like something from another era. Is this real?" Rick saw the post on his phone and felt a strange mix of pride and panic. Pride because, wow, people were hearing her. Panic because he didn't want her to get swallowed up by the noise. He'd seen it happen before. Talent discovered, packaged, sold, then forgotten when the next shiny thing came along. He found her the next day, sitting on a bench outside the public library, reading a book. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, sitting beside her. She didn't look up right away. "I did. What do you think?" She closed her book slowly. "I think music doesn't belong to fame. It belongs to the moment it's shared. If people are listening, that's a gift, but I won't chase it." He nodded. That was all he needed to hear. Still, the attention kept coming. A music blogger wrote a long piece titled, "The Ghost of American Music Plays Tuesdays in Nashville." A jazz historian reached out, saying her style reminded him of recordings from the 1950s, but with a voice all her own. A small record label called, asking if she'd consider a live album. She turned them all down, politely, firmly. But then something happened that changed her mind. Her granddaughter, quiet, bright-eyed in her early 20s, had been working 2 jobs to make ends meet. She'd been having headaches for months but kept putting off the doctor, saying she couldn't afford to miss work. One Tuesday, she came to the lounge to hear her grandmother play, and halfway through the set, she collapsed. It wasn't serious, dehydration, stress, exhaustion, but the hospital bill was. And the doctor said she needed follow-up tests, maybe even surgery for a condition she'd been ignoring. That night, after the ambulance left and the room had emptied, Rick found her sitting alone at the piano, hands in her lap, staring at the floor. "I can't lose her," she whispered, not looking at him, not after everything. Rick didn't offer empty comfort. He just sat beside her on the bench, then he said, "What if we recorded something? Just a few songs, live right here. Sell the downloads, maybe press a few CDs. All the money goes to her care." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "People would pay for that?" "People would line up," he said. She was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. "All right, but only if it's honest. No fancy studios, no tricks. Just me, this piano, and the truth." "That's all we'll need," Rick said. They set a date for the recording, 2 weeks out on a Tuesday night. Rick spread the word quietly. Special performance. Come early. Bring your ears and your hearts. He didn't say it was a recording. He didn't need to. On the night, the line stretched down the block. People brought folding chairs, blankets, even picnic baskets. Rick had to turn folks away at the door, but no one complained. They just stood outside listening through the open windows, the music spilling into the street like light. She played for nearly 2 hours. Old songs, new songs, songs no one had ever heard. She sang about sorrow and joy, about mothers and daughters, about the quiet courage it takes to keep going. And through it all, our granddaughter sat in the front row, wrapped in a shawl, tears streaming down her face, not from pain, but from pride. When it was over, no one moved. They just sat in the hush, letting the last notes settle into their bones. Rick stood in the back, arms crossed, throat tight. He looked at the woman at the piano, this quiet, unassuming soul who'd walked into his bar like any other stranger, and realized something. She hadn't just saved her granddaughter that night. She'd reminded everyone in that room what music was really for. Not fame, not money, not even applause, but connection, healing, truth. As people slowly filed out, many stopping to thank her with tears in their eyes, Rick walked over and placed a hand on the piano. "You know," he said quietly, "I once told you I'd leave if you played the piano." She looked up at him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "And yet here you are." "Here I am," he said. "And I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the city hummed with its usual noise. Cars, distant sirens, the murmur of voices. But inside the velvet note, for just a little while, there was only peace. And the echo of a song that had traveled a very long road to be heard again. After that Tuesday night recording, things changed, but not in the way most people expected. There were no flashing cameras, no record executives in fancy suits showing up with contracts, no sudden rush to book her on talk shows. Instead, the change was quieter, deeper, like roots spreading under the soil before the tree shows any sign of growing. The album, titled simply From the Shadows, was released online a few weeks later, with just a black and white photo of her hands on the piano keys as the cover. No name, no bio, no hype. Just music, but people listened. And when they did, they wanted to know more. Rick started getting calls, emails, letters even, real paper letters with stamps and shaky handwriting. A retired schoolteacher from Ohio wrote, "Your pianist's version of Wade in the Water brought me back to my childhood church. I haven't felt that kind of peace in 50 years. A young musician in Chicago said, "I've been trying to copy her left-hand phrasing for days. It's like she's speaking a language only the soul understands." And then came the historian. He showed up one rainy afternoon, not during showtime, just as Rick was sweeping the floor. He was in his late 70s, thin as a rail, with wire-rimmed glasses and a tweed coat that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. He introduced himself as a professor who'd spent his life studying American music, especially the overlooked voices, the ones history forgot. "I heard the recording," he said, voice hushed like he was in a library, "and I think I know who she is." Rick stopped sweeping. "You do?" The man nodded slowly. There was a pianist, back in the 1950s and early 60s. Never a household name, but musicians knew her. She played with some of the greats. Wrote songs under a pen name because the label said nobody wants to buy records from a woman who doesn't sing. She disappeared after 64. No one knew why. Some said she got married. Others said she died. But I always wondered. He pulled a small worn notebook from his coat pocket and flipped to a page near the back. There, in faded ink, was a name, Eleanor Mayfield, and beneath it a list of songwriting credits, songs Rick recognized instantly, tunes that had been covered by famous artists for decades but never credited to her. She used the name E.M. Langley, the professor said. I tracked down an old session log from a studio in Chicago. One entry says, "Piano, E.M. Langley, real name Eleanor Mayfield." And the description? Silver hair, quiet voice, always wore a locket with a child's photo. Rick's stomach dropped. He'd seen that locket. She wore it every Tuesday, tucked just under her collar. Why would she hide? Rick asked. The professor closed his notebook. Sometimes the world takes too much, and the only way to keep your music alive is to protect it by stepping away. That night, Rick didn't ask her outright. He waited. After the last customer left and the chairs were stacked, he sat with her at a corner table, 2 mugs of tea between them. "You ever write songs?" he asked casually, like it was just small talk. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "A few. Any that got recorded by other people?" A long pause. Then softly, Maybe. He didn't push. But the next week, during a slow moment before her set, he played an old jazz standard over the house speakers, the kind that had been covered by dozens of artists. Halfway through, she froze. "That's mine," she said so quietly he almost didn't hear. Rick turned down the music. "You wrote that?" She nodded, eyes distant. "I was 22. They told me to use a man's name if I wanted it played on the radio. So I did, said it was easier that way. Did you ever get paid?" She gave a small, sad laugh. "Not really. They said the arrangement was theirs. That I was just helping." Rick felt a hot anger rise in his chest, but he swallowed it. This wasn't about justice now. It was about her. Over the next few weeks, he started digging. Not online, there wasn't much there, but in old record store bins, library archives, second-hand bookshops. He found vinyl records with songwriting credits to E.M. Langley. He tracked down a retired session drummer who remembered her. She could play anything. Didn't need sheet music. Just listened once and had it in her fingers. And she never raised her voice, not even when they tried to cheat her. One afternoon, while helping her carry her satchel to the bus stop, Rick finally asked the question that had been burning in him. "What happened? Why'd you stop?" She didn't answer right away. They walked in silence for a block, past a playground where kids were laughing on the swings. Finally, she stopped under a big oak tree and turned to him. "I had a son," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. His name was Daniel. He was 6 years old, bright, curious, loved music more than anything. He'd sit under the piano while I practiced and hum along like he was part of the song. She took a breath. "He got sick. Real quick. 1 week he was fine, the next, gone. Just like that." Rick's throat tightened. He didn't say anything. Just stood there letting her speak. I couldn't play after that. Every note felt like a betrayal, like I was making beauty out of a world that took him away. So I stopped, sold the piano, moved out to the country, took a job teaching kids how to read. Years went by. Then my daughter, his sister, had a baby. My granddaughter. And one day that little girl sat at an old keyboard in the school music room and played Twinkle, Twinkle all by herself. And something in me woke up. She looked at Rick, eyes clear now. "I didn't come back for fame. I came back because music found me again. And this time I wasn't going to let it go." Rick nodded. He understood now. All those years of silence weren't emptiness, they were grief and love and the long road back to joy. When they reached the bus stop, he didn't say goodbye right away. Instead, he asked, "Would you let me tell your story? Not for headlines, but so people really know where this music comes from." She thought about it. Then she smiled, just a little. "Only if you promise not to make it sad." "It's not a sad story anymore." "It's not," he agreed. "It's a story about coming home." Back at the lounge, Rick started small. He added a note to the album page online. Composed and performed by Eleanor Mayfield, a pianist whose music shaped American jazz and blues long before she returned to share it with us. He included a short bio, just the facts, no drama, no pity, just truth. Within days, messages poured in, not just from fans, but from musicians who'd unknowingly played her songs for years. One famous saxophonist posted a video of himself playing one of her compositions, dedicating it to the woman who wrote the soul into this tune. A music school in New Orleans announced they'd be teaching her. Arrangements in their curriculum. But the most surprising message came from an old record company, one that had been bought, sold, and renamed 3 times since the 1960s. A young archivist had stumbled on her contracts while digitizing old files. She reached out not to claim rights but to apologize, and to offer something rare. Full ownership of her original recordings, plus royalties owed for decades. Eleanor didn't take the money for herself. She set up a small fund to help young musicians from rural towns, kids who, like her granddaughter, might not have the means to chase their dreams. Music shouldn't be locked behind money, she told Rick. It should be passed hand to hand like bread. As the weeks turned into months, the Velvet Note became more than a bar. It became a place of pilgrimage, not for selfies or drinks, but for silence, for listening. People came from all over. A retired nurse from Maine, a high school band teacher from Texas, a war veteran who said her version of Amazing Grace helped him sleep for the first time in years. And through it all, she played. Not more, not less, just faithfully every Tuesday, as if nothing had changed. though everything had. One evening, after her set, Rick found her sitting alone at the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without making a sound. "You ever miss the big stages?" he asked, leaning against the wall. She shook her head. The stage was never the point. The music was, and it's right here. She tapped her chest. "Always has been," he smiled. "Well, for what it's worth, you're playing on the only stage that matters now." She looked up at him, eyes warm. "And you're still here?" "I told you I wouldn't leave," he said, and he meant it, not just for her music, but for the quiet courage it took to keep playing after life had tried so hard to silence her. Outside, the city buzzed with noise and hurry. But inside the velvet note, time slowed, and in that space between the notes and the silence, something rare and real was growing. Not fame, not fortune, but legacy. The kind that doesn't shout, but endures. The kind that lives in the hearts of those who listen and pass it on. The album kept selling, not in huge numbers, but steadily, like a river carving its path through stone. Enough to cover the medical bills. Enough to give her granddaughter breathing room, time to heal and even go back to school part-time. That alone would have been enough for her. But life, as it often does, had more in store. One morning, Rick opened the lounge to find a man in a well-tailored suit sitting at the bar, sipping black coffee and reading a newspaper. He looked out of place, too polished for the worn stools and chipped mugs, but he didn't act like he owned the room. He just waited patiently until Rick came over. "I heard the recording," the man said, folding the paper. "And I'd like to talk to the pianist." Rick crossed his arms. "She's not looking for a record deal." "I'm not offering one," the man said gently. "I'm with a nonprofit that supports elder artists, musicians, painters, writers, who've been overlooked or forgotten. We help with healthcare, housing, studio space. Dignity, really. We'd like to honor her, maybe host a small concert. Cover travel, lodging, everything." Rick studied him. No flash, no pushiness. Just sincerity. He'd learned to spot the difference. "I'll ask her," he said. That Tuesday after her set, Rick brought it up. She listened quietly, stirring her tea. "A concert?" she asked. "Small. Intimate. Just people who truly care about the music." She was silent for a long time. "Then only if my granddaughter can come. And only if it's not about me. It's about the songs." The man agreed without hesitation. The event was set for a historic theater in downtown Nashville, a place with velvet seats, a grand piano, and a stage that had hosted legends, but they didn't advertise it as a comeback. They called it an evening of forgotten songs and listed her only as a guest pianist. Still, tickets sold out in hours. The night of the concert, she wore a simple navy dress, the same pearls and the locket. Her granddaughter sat in the front row, wrapped in a soft shawl, looking healthier than she had in months. Rick stood in the wings, heart pounding like he was the one about to perform. When she walked on stage, the audience rose, not out of obligation, but out of instinct, like standing for something sacred. She didn't bow, just sat, placed her hands on the keys and began. She played songs no one had heard in 50 years, her own compositions, rediscovered like buried treasure. She played the blues that had echoed through Chicago clubs, the gospel-tinged melodies that had comforted weary souls, the quiet lullabies she'd written for a little boy who never got to grow up. And she played new ones, too, songs born in the velvet note, in the quiet hours between grief and grace. Halfway through, she spoke, just a few words, soft but clear. "These songs didn't leave me," she said. "I left them. But they waited. And when I was ready, they came back like old friends knocking on the door." No one clapped. They just listened, tears glistening in the dim light. After the final note faded, the silence lasted so long that Rick thought maybe time had stopped. Then the room erupted, not in cheers, but in something deeper. A standing ovation that felt like a prayer. Backstage, the man from the nonprofit handed her a small envelope. "This is from our foundation," he said. "It's not payment. It's support. For as long as you need it." She opened it later, alone. Inside was a check, enough to secure her home for years, and a note. "Your music gave us back a piece of our history. Let us give you peace in return." But the real surprise came a week later. A young woman showed up at the Velvet Note during the day, when the place was empty. She carried a worn guitar case and looked nervous. She asked if she could speak to the pianist. Rick called her over. The young woman fidgeted, then said, My grandmother, she used to play your songs on an old radio in our kitchen. She said they got her through the hardest days of her life, raising 6 kids alone, working double shifts. She passed last year. But before she died, she made me promise to find you and say thank you. She pulled a small cassette tape from her pocket. She recorded your music off the radio in the 70s, said it was the only thing that made her feel seen. Eleanor took the tape gently, like it was made of glass. I never knew, she whispered. You don't have to, the young woman said. But I needed you to know that your music, it lived, even when you weren't playing. That moment changed something in her. Not her humility, that never wavered, but her understanding of what her silence had cost and what her return had given. She started saying yes to small things. A local school invited her to talk to music students. She went, not to teach technique, but to say, play because it matters to you, not because someone tells you to. A community center asked if she'd lead a workshop for seniors learning piano for the first time. She did, patiently guiding wrinkled hands over the keys, reminding them that it's never too late to begin again. Rick watched all this with quiet pride. He'd seen how fame could hollow people out, but this was different. She wasn't being lifted up as a star. She was being welcomed back as a neighbor, a teacher, a keeper of songs. Then came the idea that would change everything. One slow afternoon, as they sat sharing a pot of coffee, Rick said, You know, this place, it could be more than just a bar. She raised an eyebrow. Oh, what if we turned it into a home for musicians like you? Not just pianists, anyone who's been playing for years but got pushed aside because they're not young or flashy enough. A place where the music isn't about trends, but truth. She looked around the room, the scuffed floor, the old piano, the photos now hanging on the wall, her at the keyboard, the crowd listening, her granddaughter smiling in the front row. It already is, she said softly. But what if we made it official? Rick pressed. A nonprofit. We could offer small stipends, recording time, even help with medical bills. You'd be the heart of it. She didn't answer right away. But that night after her set, she said, Only if you run it. I'll play. I'll listen. But you're the one who sees people. So they did it. They called it the Listening Room Project. Not flashy. Just honest. Rick filed the paperwork, reached out to local donors, and converted the back storage space into a tiny recording studio. The first artist they helped was a banjo player in his 80s, who'd written protest songs during the civil rights movement, but never recorded them. The second was a gospel singer who'd lost her voice to illness but still wrote lyrics every day. They gave them time, space, and respect, and every Tuesday she played, not as a headliner but as an anchor, a reminder of why they were there. News spread, not through algorithms but through word of mouth, through tears shared over coffee, through songs passed from one generation to the next. A documentary filmmaker heard about the project and asked to film a short piece, not about fame but about legacy. They agreed on one condition: no dramatization, just truth. The film showed her teaching a shy teenager how to find the blues in a simple chord progression. It showed Rick helping an old fiddler tune his instrument. It showed the banjo player singing a song he wrote in 1963 to a room full of college students who sat in stunned silence. When it aired online, it didn't go viral in the usual sense. But it found its people. Teachers showed it in class. Community centers screened it. And donations started coming in, not huge sums, but enough to keep the lights on, to buy new strings, to pay for a bus ticket so a singer from rural Kentucky could come record her songs. Through it all, she remained the same. She still took the bus, still wore her faded dresses, still played with the same quiet intensity that had first stunned Rick years ago. But now, when she walked into the lounge, people didn't just listen, they leaned in. They brought their own stories. A man once told her, "My wife and I danced to one of your songs the night before she passed. Thank you for giving us that moment." A young girl handed her a drawing of a piano with wings. "Because your music flies," she said. One evening, after a particularly moving set, Rick found her sitting alone in the empty room, hands resting on the piano lid. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" he asked, sitting beside her. She smiled faintly. "All the time. But I don't regret the silence. It taught me that music isn't about being heard by everyone. It's about being true to the one who plays it and the one who needs to hear it." He nodded. Well, you're being heard now. By the right people. She looked around the room. The photos, the flowers left on the piano, the worn path in the carpet where so many had come to sit and listen. Yes, she said softly, and that's enough. Outside, the city hummed with its usual rush, but inside the Velvet Note, now also known as the listening room, time moved differently. Slower, deeper. And in that space, something beautiful was growing, not an empire, not a brand, but a community built on the simple, radical act of paying attention. And every Tuesday, when she played, the world outside faded away, and all that mattered was the music, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that return after a long silence, not to shout, but to heal. Years passed, but Tuesdays never changed. Rain or shine, hot summer evenings or cold winter nights, the door of the Velvet Note, now quietly known to many as the listening room, would open at 7:30, and by 8, she'd be at the piano. Her hair had turned fully sylvie. Her hands showed more veins and age spots, but her touch on the keys remained steady. Sure, full of the same quiet fire that had first stunned a skeptical bar owner all those years ago. The place itself had grown, but not in the way most businesses do. There were no neon signs, no flashy renovations, just small, meaningful changes. A second-hand upright piano in the back room for young musicians to practice, a shelf filled with donated sheet music, a bulletin board where local artists posted flyers for open mics or benefit concerts. The walls were covered not with ads but with photos, black and white shots of elders playing fiddles, harmonicas, accordions, candid moments of hands teaching hands, eyes lighting up at the first clear note. Rick had aged too. His laugh was softer now, his steps a little slower, but his eyes still lit up the same way they had the first time he heard her play. He'd stopped thinking of the place as his bar. It was something else now. A harbor, a home, a living archive of voices that refused to be forgotten. Every Tuesday the room filled. Not with crowds chasing a trend, but with people seeking something real. College students sat beside retirees. Tourists who'd heard whispers in coffee shops stayed longer than planned. Parents brought their kids not to entertain them but to teach them how to listen. And always in the front row sat her granddaughter, now a music teacher herself, often with a student or two in tow, showing them what it meant to play with your whole heart. One spring evening, as cherry blossoms drifted past the windows, the room was fuller than usual, not because of an announcement but because word had spread. This would be her last regular Tuesday. She hadn't made a big deal of it. Just mentioned it quietly to Rick one afternoon while they shared tea. "I think it's time," she'd said. "My hands still work, but my bones get tired faster now. I don't want to play when I can't give the music everything it deserves." Rick had wanted to argue, to beg her to stay, but he knew better. She'd given more than anyone could ask for. It was time to honor her choice, not fight it. So they planned a simple gathering, no fanfare, just music, friends, and gratitude. That night, the air felt different, thicker, sweeter, like the room itself was holding its breath. People arrived early, bringing flowers, handwritten notes, even small jars of homemade jam with little tags that read, "For your tea." The piano had been polished until it gleamed, and someone had placed a single white rose on the music stand. At 8 o'clock, she walked in, not with a grand entrance, but with the same quiet grace she always had. She wore her favorite dress, the navy one with the tiny pearl buttons, and the locket rested just above her collarbone, catching the light. She didn't speak at first, just sat, placed her hands on the keys, and began. She played the song she'd played on her very first night, the one no one knew, the one that had stopped time in its tracks. Then she moved through the years, the blues that carried sorrow like a river, the gospel tunes that lifted spirits, the lullabies stitched with love and loss. She played songs she'd written for her son, for her granddaughter, for strangers who'd written her letters saying her music had saved them on their darkest nights. And then, halfway through, she did something new. She stopped, looked out at the room, and said, "This next one, I'd like to share." From the back, a young woman stepped forward, barely 20, with nervous hands and a voice like clear water. She'd been coming to the lounge for months, sitting in the back, too shy to speak. But Rick had heard her humming along once and gently invited her to try the back piano. Now she stood beside the grand, trembling but determined. "This is my song," the young woman said softly. "I wrote it after hearing you play River Without Banks. It's called Still Here," and she began to sing. Her voice wasn't perfect. It cracked once on a high note, but it was honest, raw, full of the kind of hope that only comes after you've known pain. The song was about losing a parent, about finding your voice again, about the quiet strength of women who play piano in dimly lit rooms and change the world without ever asking for credit. When she finished, the room didn't clap right away. They just sat in the hush, letting the last note settle like dust in sunlight. Then slowly she turned to the older woman at the piano and said, "Thank you for showing me that music isn't about being perfect. It's about being true." Tears filled the older woman's eyes. She reached out, took the young woman's hand, and squeezed it. "You've already found your song," she said. "Now keep singing it." That moment, simple, unscripted, human, was worth more than any award, any headline. After the music ended, Rick stepped forward. He hadn't planned to speak, but something in him wouldn't let the night pass without saying what needed to be said. He cleared his throat, looked out at the faces, some familiar, some new, all connected by the same thread of listening, and began. "A long time ago," he said, voice rough with emotion, "I told someone that if she played the piano, I'd leave." A few people chuckled softly, remembering the story that had become legend around the lounge. "Well," he continued, glancing at her, "I never left. And I never will. Because she didn't just play piano. She taught me how to listen. To music, to people, to the quiet parts of life that most folks rush past." He paused, swallowed hard. "She walked in here thinking she was just another old woman with a satchel and a few songs. But she was never just anything. She was a keeper of stories, a healer of hearts, a quiet force who reminded us that art doesn't need a spotlight to matter. It just needs someone willing to share it and someone willing to hear it." He turned to her. "You once told me your story wasn't sad anymore, and you were right. Because you turned your silence into song, your grief into grace, and your love into a legacy that's still growing." The room was silent, but full of love, full of memory, full of the kind of respect that doesn't need words. She stood then, slowly, and walked to the center of the room, not to bow but to speak. "I never came back for fame," she said, voice steady. "I came back because music found me again. And because someone," she looked at Rick, "was kind enough to let me play even when he didn't know who I was." She smiled. "But here's the truth. I wasn't a legend when I walked in. I became one because you all listened. You gave my songs a home, and that's the greatest gift an artist can receive." Then she did something unexpected. She walked to the back piano, the old upright in the corner, and sat down. "This one's for the next generation," she said, and she began to play a simple melody. Just a few notes repeated, inviting. One by one, others joined. The young singer hummed along. A retired saxophonist pulled out his horn. A teenager tapped a rhythm on the table. Even Rick, who hadn't touched an instrument in decades, found himself clapping softly in time. It wasn't a performance. It was a circle, a passing of the torch, not with ceremony but with song. After that night, she didn't disappear. She still came by, sometimes to listen, sometimes to offer a word of advice to a nervous performer, sometimes just to sit in the back with a cup of tea and watch the music unfold. She taught a few private lessons, mostly to kids who reminded her of her granddaughter, and every now and then, on a quiet evening when the room felt especially still, she'd sit at the piano and play just one song, never announced, never expected, always a gift. Rick kept the listening room going, but he wasn't alone anymore. Her granddaughter helped run the workshops. The young singer became a regular performer. Even the old banjo player from Kentucky came down once a month to lead a song circle. The mission stayed the same: honor the music, respect the musician, protect the space where truth can be heard. Years later, on a crisp autumn evening, a group of high school students visited as part of a music history project. They'd been assigned to study unsung contributors to American music, and their teacher had brought them to the Velvet Note. As they sat at the back tables, notebooks open, one of them whispered, "Is it true she played with all those famous people?" Rick, now with more gray in his beard than black, smiled. "She did. But that's not why she matters." "Then why?" the student asked. "Because she never stopped believing that music was worth playing. even when no one was listening. And when people finally did listen, she didn't change. She just kept giving. The students fell quiet as an elderly man with a harmonica began to play a tune older than any of them. They watched, listened, and for the first time understood that greatness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a woman in a faded dress, playing piano in a small room, changing the world one note at a time. And somewhere in the back, she sat with her granddaughter, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed, smiling, not because of applause, but because the music was still alive. It always would be, because she had taught them all the most important lesson, that every song matters, every voice counts, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up and play.